The RDF industry group, I should just tell you about that for a moment. That was a group that we initiated about 3 years ago. And it's a group that is made up of parties along the supply chain, the RDF supply chain, who have an interest in RDF exports. And I'll tell you a bit more about them later. Let me just... So there's the, well, crudely speaking, there's the supply chain. Bales of waste being stored, being exported. The group members, there's about nearly 30 of them, and there's some sort of household names you'll recognise in the sort of Veolias and Suez and Shanks, or what should be Renewy now. There are traders in there that get involved in linking different parties along the supply chain together. There are what I call aggregators, those that don't actually produce the waste but collect waste from producers, or have facilities that receive waste from producers. They aggregate it, bale it up, maybe do some pre-treatment, etc., and then they seek off-takers and the supply chain to get the waste away typically into Europe, mostly into Europe. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then you have a number of the off-takers. You'll recognise organisations like EEW and AEB and Atero and Twents and EFO, who represent a number of the Swedish off-takers. We've got the nations represented on the group are Norway, Holland, Sweden, Germany. In terms of the off-takers, we've got representation in terms of producers from pretty much the whole of the UK and the Republic of Ireland. What does the group do? It basically looks at issues of common interest across the supply chain and communicates that. So the sort of things on the agenda for the group published this report last September before last, which was looking at the rationales of RDF export. To some extent, that document is a simple myth buster, really, to make sure that the real issues are addressed. And it does address things like the extent to which RDF exports are they an engine for waste crime, or are they just something that gets caught up in the debate? And it addresses issues to do with the additional environmental impacts of transport and whether or not that's a significant contributing factor when compared to where the material is coming from and going to. So that's the kind of thing that's covered in that report. It's still valid. It's 2 years old, but it's still valid. It's worth a read. There's some life cycle assessment work in there as well that addresses the environmental issues. And it also looks at some of the legislative framework around export and actually how does it work, how does it happen. The current work the group is doing is we are looking at a code of practice. And that is going to be launched next month, and that's going to be setting out the sort of minimum standards that good quality RDF export supply chain would look like. There won't be many surprises for those in the sector, although I guess some people are only involved in certain parts of the supply chain, and that's I suppose that's going to be a document that sets a standard to some extent and will get built upon over subsequent years. Another piece of work that's going on that's actually relevant to the wider industry than just the RDF, those involved in RDF export, is actually relevant to anybody involved in residual waste handling and storage at all, let alone the storage of other potentially flammable materials. And that's looking at FPPs, fire prevention plans. So alongside ESA, the RDF group is working with the Environment Agency to look at residual waste specific guidance for fire prevention plans. At the moment, there's a lot of guidance and work out there on fire prevention plans. Generally, the Wood Recyclers Association have specific guidance about fire prevention plans for their materials, and the idea is that this document is going to be created jointly in order to put some detail around fire prevention plans for residual waste and including RDF. just to sort of trail my presentation a little bit late in the proceedings, this is to some extent going to be a state of the nation, a mostly factual snapshot. I'll try and avoid too many opinions. There's a panel debate shortly after I finish where I think you'll get quite some pretty healthy debates and discussions going on. So I'm going to try and not to steal any of the thunder that's going to be going on there, and to some extent I just want to set the scene with facts and figures, I guess. So market trends, one of the things I was asked to look at. So I guess there's 4 fundamental market drivers, if I can put it this way. There's the whole supply and demand debate, which if anybody hasn't picked up on, is about whether or not we have enough residual waste treatment capacity for the amount of residual waste that we have today, and whether or not that balance or imbalance is going to get better or worse going into the future. If we don't have more residual waste than the treatment facilities we have in the UK, it's unlikely you're going to have as much RDF export. So RDF exports, to some extent, actually is significantly, to an extent, a significant extent, is a result of the fact that at the moment, and for the past 5 or 6 years, there has been insufficient treatment capacity in the UK to deal with the waste coming out of landfill, if I can put it that way. Obviously, it doesn't actually come out of landfill, but as landfill tax has gone up, landfills become increasingly unaffordable compared to the alternatives, and that's made RDF exports affordable. One of the other market drivers is the exchange rate, and again, in case anybody missed it, Brexit has had a small impact on the value of the it probably explains why we've got so many of our European visitors here today. It costs them virtually nothing to be here. But for us, going over there, it costs a lot, and the gate fees have gone up. And they've certainly gone up for anybody that's locked into contracts paying for them in euros. And I dare say there'll be negotiations even for those that haven't, and for contracts as they come back up for renegotiation is going to have an impact. The pound goes far less further than it did, 20–25% less far than it did only just over a year ago. The amount of landfill we have, which to some extent is a symptom of the supply and demand. The waste is coming out of landfill. Landfill's expensive. I think that there's a difference between how much landfill capacity we have and how accessible it is. It isn't right to say a problem with landfill running out. That probably was a lot more of an accurate thing to say 5–10 years ago. There's far less waste going to landfill now than there was 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. If anything, there's too much landfill capacity is arguable. The issue is it's very expensive. Now, there is definitely a serious point in terms of the closure, in many cases the early closure of landfill sites as they become uneconomical because the throughputs have gone too low. So there is an issue clearly with the amount of waste going to landfill, but the main driver for the amount of waste going to landfill is the landfill tax driving it out. It's not that there isn't enough landfill. Things can change going forward, obviously. And the other main driver, obviously, not to forget, is that there's a major pull effect from spare capacity in good quality EFW, many CHP facilities, many of them are CHP facilities on the continent, in particular Holland, Sweden, Germany, Denmark, Norway. I'll talk a little bit more about the nations involved shortly. So they're the drivers. How is RDF exported? I'm probably preaching to the converted here largely, but I suppose crudely speaking, 3 main ways. I think in the early days it was mostly curtain siders. Curtain siders, very easy way to take 20 tons or so of RDF bales, roll on, roll off ferry, and that's going to work really well when you're heading off to Holland. If you want to go further afield, you're going to tie up a lot of equipment in your articulated lorry if you start putting it on ferries to Sweden. So we've got other systems that are being coming on stream much faster. So you've got the bulk movement. You know, this is probably, I don't actually know where that photograph is, I should, but it's probably a 2,000 or 3,000 ton coaster taking waste from a port in the UK My guess is it's going to Sweden, could be going somewhere else. And here we have an example of a slider system or a containerization system where containers are used, and that provides a little bit of added flexibility because you're storing the waste in a different way. You've got access to the tunnel as well. So they're the main methods. The diagram on the right just gives you an idea of the main exit routes from England. It's not as easy to get the data from Wales and Scotland, I'm afraid. I haven't got that at the moment. But there's just a quick diagram we put together which shows the main exit routes from England. So you see some of the ports are taking 500,000 tonnes plus the green ones. So places like Immingham, no surprise, and Felixstowe. And then right the way down to the smaller ports, lower than 20,000 tonnes, even places like Falmouth and Liverpool, Workington. The ports that can take 3,000 tonne coasters around the UK, there's about 50 of them. There are a lot of small ports that, in terms of the ships that they can accommodate, there's a lot of those ports. So it's relatively easy in this format, because the ports I'm talking about here aren't necessarily containerized ports. The smaller ones are the bulk ports taking things like animal feed and aggregate. This kind of system can work from many, many more ports than are indicated there. So unsurprisingly, as an island, we've got lots of ways of getting bulk materials away. So how much waste is being exported? So back in the early days, 2010, there was virtually no export. Now there was some because I'm wrapping RDF and SRF together, and I'll split those out in a bit later. So high value, high quality SRF fuels going to cement kilns have been being exported for a long time, but relatively crude residual waste with minimal treatment, which is what a bulk of the RDF being exported is, only really started back in about 2010, 2011. And that ramping up, or that ramping up there, if you were to draw a graph of the landfill tax escalator, and to some extent a graph of the gate fees of the receiving facilities in Holland, it would be on the same trajectory. They're all linked. It's all driven by the landfill tax, taking opportunity of the spare capacity that existed overseas. So what does this show? We've got Holland is the big early starter, 2011, 2012, 2013. Then you see Holland starting to level off. That's not because the Dutch lost interest. It's because their facilities started to fill up. There's only so much capacity available. And then you see increasing amounts going to Sweden, Germany, and others coming on stream. I guess the other main trend that you see from this chart is that things are levelling off. Levelling off for the UK as a whole at about 3.5 million tonnes. If you include the Republic of Ireland, it's about 4 million tonnes. We're on record as having predicted 4 to 5 million tonnes is where it will rest for quite a few years now, and that does seem to be right. We're unlikely to see above 4 million tonnes, and again, that's largely driven by the amount of capacity that actually is available on the continent. Now that could change over time. We're not here to talk about the impacts in Europe of the circular economy package and increased recycling rates and what's that going to do in Holland and Sweden and Denmark, and whether or not, if that does mean big increases in recycling, does that mean less residual waste? Yes, it does. Does that mean more capacity in their existing facilities? Yes, it does. But we're not here to talk about that. So it could change. Maybe it will go up a little bit more, but there's no immediate additional capacity, with the possible exception of there are some new facilities still being built, even in nations where they have more capacity than waste. So we've got new facilities, relatively new facilities, being built recently in Sweden, and there's a relatively new facility in Denmark as well. And of course, in those nations, it's all about CHP. It's all about the demand for heat. that demand requires certain boiler capacities to be built, and then the fuel needs to be found for it. And waste is one of the options, obviously, alongside biomass, fossil fuels, etc. This doesn't show an awful lot of difference to what I showed you before. It shows the years increasing for the amount that's being exported. The main additional thing that this shows, I suppose, is the slight seasonal variation. So you'll see there's more export in the winter than the summer, and that's mainly, if you were to do these charts just for Sweden, there'd be a much bigger difference, because there, again, it's about the demand for heat. The demand goes down in the summer, so less is exported. If you did the chart just for Holland, not quite as much CHP, the chart would be a lot flatter, but overall you see a little bit of a variance seasonally when you look at it month on month. Okay, who is exporting? Got a few slides here to show you. This is just about comparing the total amount of RDF that's been exported with the number of exporters. So this is month on month since, sorry, it's quarterly, I think, since 2010, right the way up to the present day. You see the total RDF being exported going up in orange. The total number of active exporters, just to be clear, an active exporter is somebody who applies for and gets a TFS notification. It's not necessarily one of the, any one of a number of organisations along a particular supply chain can be the applicant, so it doesn't necessarily reflect exactly who is doing the exporting. But in terms of who is applying for the TFS, you can see those numbers are coming down in the last couple of years. And one of the other things we've seen is a consolidation of the sector. It's learning, it's getting more efficient, it's trying different ports and different logistics methods, and the relationships, the contractual relationships between the parties involved is maturing, and so we're seeing bigger, longer term contracts between parties. So whereas in the early, I can remember back in 2012, 13, 14, there were a lot of what I would call small brokers who could quickly link up waste producers with spare capacity all over Holland and Germany in particular, and could get involved in the in the sector. That happens less and less now as we're seeing market consolidation. Who are the exporters? So this only goes to 2016. Biffa, top of the pile, just exporting over 400,000 tonnes in 2016. And these are only the top 10, right the way down. Shanks or Renewy, New Earth Solutions, now part of Panda. There's been a few changes here. So I'm just trying to think, are there any particular patterns to highlight here? No, probably not. I think N&P, you can see their market increase in the last couple of years. I'm pretty sure in 2017, N&P, for what it's worth, will be the biggest exporter. Don't know if there's any prizes for that, but I think they'll probably overtake Biffa. So there's some changes, but they're the big players. I guess as an observation of the big UK waste companies, apologies, I hope I don't cause any offence here, Shanks, Renewy, sorry, Suez, Biffa, Veolia is in other, which I'll show you later, and yeah, there's a few others. I'll come on to the UK companies actually in a moment. So how am I doing for time? So top 5 countries. Where's the waste actually going to? Let's just have a quick look at where it's going. There's Holland, 1.7 million, right the way down, totaling 4 million. This is including Republic of Ireland. So there's the 4 million coming out of the UK and Republic of Ireland, most of it from England. Second biggest from Republic of Ireland. Then you've got Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Again, just to be clear, this doesn't necessarily reflect where the waste arises. It reflects the exit port through which it left the UK or Ireland. So we're pretty sure that quite a lot of Scottish waste exits England. There are differences in the bonding arrangements required by regulators even within the UK, and that may explain why some opt to exit from England. But anyway, there we are, 4 million tonnes, 1.7 to the Netherlands. So it's the English and the Republic of Ireland that, like the Dutch and the Germans, and the Welsh and the Scottish seem to favour the Danish and the Swedes. You can make of that what you will, and you can see Norway coming in there as well. We've got all these other nations in here that are, still relevant. This is interesting. I don't know what that one is. I must look at that soon. Being exported to UK. Maybe that's Ireland into the UK somewhere, and maybe with Poolbeg opening in Dublin with 600,000. I think literally this week it's gone into full commission or into full operation. Who knows? Maybe we'll see export into the Republic of Ireland, or less export from the Republic of Ireland. So top 5 countries, who's exporting to them? So this data, by the way, in terms of tracking which facilities waste is going, which nation's waste is going through, the data is much better for England than it is for the UK as a whole and Republic of Ireland. So that's the reason I've got 1.7 million tonnes there for Holland, but actually here I've only got 1.5. This is only England. So, I mean, these slides are, I presume, available, Sarah, on the website afterwards, so feel free not to scribble. You're not going to take all this in, but it just gives you a flavour. Netherlands the biggest, then Germany, then Sweden. We know that. I showed you that on the previous slides. Here's the top 10 exporters. You recognise Biffa, Suez, NNP, down to, here's the others, another million tonnes amongst the others, actually. And here we have the off-takers. So you'll recognise off-takers in Holland like Twents, and in Germany like RWE and EEW, and Sweden like Maller Energy. You'll recognise all these. These are, and there's the tonnages that they're receiving. And to the extent, there's no particular patterns here, but there are some. You can get a flavour if you want to for which nations different exporters are favouring dealing with. I've just broken these down by nation, so if you want to look at these later, have a look at these slides. So for the Netherlands, here we go, Biffa all the way down, AVR, AB, Twents, unsurprising, these are the ones with large tonnage, Atero. If you're just taking the Netherlands as of interest, I suppose it's interesting to note that I don't know whether we still talk about the big 6 waste companies in the UK anymore. It doesn't seem to fit anymore. But of the big 6, as I used to think about them, I've been in this sector 30 years now. So you recognise Biffa, you recognise FCC, Suez, Veolia, and Renewi, Shanks. Maybe it's big 7. The 2 that aren't there, you won't find Corey, and you won't find Viridor. I suppose that's not completely surprising if you take a company like Biffa. Biffa is a massive collector and owner and pre-treater, if I can put it that way, of waste, but heavily relies on others to do the treatment. No surprise, therefore, that Biffa's one of, if not the biggest exporters, whereas someone like Viridor is not on there. Viridor is a massive treater of waste. They have some wheels, but their main activity is treatment facilities. So in the UK, so they have less need, I guess, to export. Anyway, that's just my own observations to explain why you're seeing quite a very significant divergence within what you might have considered to be one sector of the big companies in the UK, massive divergence in terms of their appetite and interest in export. Germany, I'm not sure that's going to tell us anything different. It just gives you an idea of who is particularly focused on Germany. So I guess it tells you N&P are in particular. You get an idea of who the main off-takers. I guess if you're in the market to find off-takers, this isn't a bad place to think about who calling up. You can see who's got capacity, who's obviously taking materials. And just to finish the picture, Sweden, lots from Suez. Again, people like Maller Energy I mentioned earlier, Renova. Denmark, I mean, these numbers are getting smaller now because Denmark isn't huge. Couple 100,000 tons in total. And interesting, the biggest exporter to Denmark is one of the main traders in the sector, not a UK operator and not an off-taker, somebody who develops the supply chain with customers at both ends, or clients and customers at both ends. Norway's sort of crept into the top 5. There's been quite a lot of activity in Norway in the last year or two that didn't exist before. I guess to some extent, as the nearer, easier to access facilities fill up and the demand is still there, then waste will travel further, and no doubt the gate fees need to be slightly lower to compensate for that. How much time have I got left? 2 minutes, all right, okay. I'm just going to touch on SRF briefly. It all gets lumped in. Apologies to anybody who's heavily involved in the SRF sector. It's not because that it isn't important, it isn't because it doesn't have some really interesting nuances associated with it. SRF is happy to talk at length if people want me to, what I think is the difference in RDF and SRF. Everybody's got their own definitions. But what we're talking about here is high quality fuels prepared from waste to a high CV to go into the cement or possibly the lime industry. Look at the numbers there. These are annual numbers. They're tiny compared to the 4 million tons total. So I just wanted to put that into context, and you can see I presume most people have heard about the export to places like Latvia in the last couple of years, quite a bit of export to Portugal, Denmark, and actually, interestingly, this year has been quite a bit of export to the Bulgarian cement industry as well. It's only about 10,000 tons. So let's, again, I don't want to get too for that to be a major issue. In terms of RDF exports as a whole, this is a significant subcategory that has all sorts of explanations and drivers and hurdles of its own. Okay, market issues, Brexit. I've only got a couple of minutes, so I'm going to have to rush through this. So, what might Brexit mean for the RDF export market? It's obviously a key question. So I'm just going to tackle a couple of the areas, and to the extent that we can make any prediction, I'm going to try and give an idea. So on TFS implications, what happens if we leave Europe and the TFS regulations somehow fall away? Well, the TFS rules implement OECD rules. That's the first thing to remember. So RDF export can happen with or without TFS, so long as under OECD rules, so long as the export and import is between OECD signatories, and all of the nations I mentioned so far, all OECD signatories. So on the face of it, the Great Repeal Bill stroke OECD rules would allow the continuation without the need for fundamentally new legislation. Exchange rate, I mean, I've talked earlier about one of the drivers and one of the problems. The exchange rate has significantly weakened. The costs are going up. They've got to churn their way through the contracts, of course, and some of them are long term. And who knows, there may be further increases as well. Trade. So, what kind of trade deal are we going to have? What kind of future relationship we're going to have? Well, we don't know. If the harder Brexit occurs and worse comes to worse, if you can put it that way, then WTO rules potentially kick in, and then there is the possibility of a 6.5% tariff. However, for that worst case scenario to happen, there's a couple of tests that would have to fail. First of all, we would have to fail the argument. You'd have to fail the argument that this is a service being imported, not a good being exported. And even if you weren't to win that argument, then there is the fact that the goods being exported has a negative value. And a negative value goods shouldn't trigger the tariff and WTO rules. And there's some examples of that in what's going on between Norway and Sweden that can be looked at. I've just thrown this one in here, and that's not to suggest it's not possible or important. It's just I can't say anything more about it than that. But clearly it is possible to impose political barriers to export, putting in, I don't know, limits or caps or whatever. It's possible that there could be a political decision either to stop exports or to reduce exports going out or to minimise them coming into certain member states. We don't see any sign or indication of that or any particular arguments for it, but strange things happen, so I just wanted to include it. Logistics, if there is all sorts of issues with the customs coming out of the customs union, if that were to cause issues to do with materials entering and leaving the nation, then RDF Exports could get caught up in that. The only reason that may be a slightly bigger issue for RDF is that could, I suppose, on the face of it, extend the requirement for material to be stored, and we know that storing of RDF can be an issue. So, final slide. Thank you. Sorry for running over a couple of minutes. Rapid growth since 2010. 2017 looks to be pretty similar to 2016, so it looks like we're leveling off. Consolidation of the marketplace, less people doing the exporting and seeming to do it for longer periods within contracts. As we saw in the slides where I broke down where the waste was going to, multiple off-takers involved. I didn't actually count them, but it's 50 off-takers maybe. Slight rise in SRF being exported and some uncertainty around the impacts of Brexit, but it doesn't look likely that that's going to be decisive in terms of the market.